それでは
Ladies and gentlemen, the second part, the formation of the San Francisco system in Asia, East Asia session will start. Professor Shin Kawashima, Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the University of Tokyo, and Professor HOSOYA. There will be lead discussion by those two gentlemen. Now we would like to start the part 2. As you can see in your program, in the second part, we are going to talk about the formation of the San Francisco system in East Asia. At the outset, I was requested to say a few words, but it was better for me to have the presence of Professor HOSOYA for the encouragement to me. Now, speaking of the history and territory, in most cases, we have some problems with neighboring countries, and we also have still lingering issues of reparations. But as for the San Francisco system, there was that the Philippines and Cambodia signed this San Francisco Treaty, but ROC and the PRC, they did not sign those the San Francisco Treaty. Now, how are we going to interpret such aspect? Now, some scholarly aspects. The San Francisco Treaty itself and the system that follow the signing, from the viewpoint of historical records, the U.S. and the UK historical documents are used as sources for study. And then some of the documents were released by the Japanese government, but most of those documents, the release was delayed. And so in the first stage, the formation of the interpretation was made based on those documents. But looking back on the 20 years, there is a new phenomena that is taking place. The post-war historical documents were released by the Japanese government. That's for one thing. ROK, ROC, or Southeast Asian nations, and the PRC. Even PRC. Well, it is now closing its door, but it also disclosed some of the documents. And in terms of the volume, I should say and admit some of those countries are ahead of Japan. So ROK and ROC and PRC should be also, and those related documents were also used for the study. And going forward, that the Japan, as well as the United States and the UK, were the leaders in doing the research in this area. But how the viewpoints of those Asian nations, Asian neighbors, are going to be incorporated. Multi-archival approach, in addition to UK and the US documents, the French and Japanese documents were used, and that was how the approach, multilateral approach was. But going forward, how's the comprehensive approach is going to be adopted in writing the post-war history with the inclusion of documentations from Asian neighbors? And if those things are going to be incorporated, and then we will be able to have better understanding of the issues of territory and reparations and others. So, I hope that we'll be able to take up such a challenging task in the second half. Professor Sakamoto was talking about the hot war. I think in the past that the Cold War concept was somewhat Eurocentric. The Cold War was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but there was a hot war in East Asia. So I think in Asia there was the hot war, And there was the precondition for the hot war. That was the existence of divided nations. In the Korean Peninsula, in China, or in Vietnam, there were divided nations. In Europe, the defeated Germany, it was divided. But in East Asia, victorious nations, for instance, in China, or the colonies, Vietnam, and Korean Peninsula were divided. Japan avoided the division of the nation, although it was a defeated nation. And the Korean War had a great impact on the formation of the system. And there was also an issue, so-called hub and hopes. This is the third character, centering on the United States, Japan, ROK, and the United States, ROK, and ANZUS. And so centering on the U.S., there were bilateral security frameworks that were established. And Japan, ROK, and Japan, ROC, and Japan, the Philippines, there were no security arrangements. It was completely different from the situation of Europe with the existence of NATO. And Professor Hatano was doing the research on some of the historical documents. There was no agreement between Korea and Japan, but there were also some exchanges of the armed forces or the national security level between those two countries, including between ROC and Japan. So those spokes, the relationship with the U.S. were somewhat unique. As for the ROK and the Philippines, those countries were authoritarian regimes and very strong anti-communist states. Only Japan was democratized. The Communist Party and the Socialist Party were accepted as political parties in Japan. And there was a large restriction imposed on, for example, movement of the people with those countries. That also had a lot of influence on the future, on the developments of the relationship. Those governments that ended the war were authoritarian. Now, as for the relationship with Japan, the people of those countries, the negotiating countries, were not democratic or represented the nation. And if there was supposed to be democratization process, and it would mean there was a resurgence of renegotiation of some of the matters. Now, as for the San Francisco system, as has been mentioned by many experts, there were those signatories and non-signatories. They were all diverse. The relationship with Asian neighbors was quite diverse from the viewpoint of the San Francisco system. There were those nations that signed and ratified, for example, that Indonesia, but Indonesia did not ratify that. And the ROK was another country that entered into a bilateral treaty, and Burma was another partner based on Article 26. So there were diverse situations depending on Asian neighbors. The things that we have to pay attention to in this regard is that the existence of the matter of colonies. That the peace treaty and the colonies, they could be separated, but they were mingled in together in the process. For ROK and ROC, there were authoritarian regimes, in particular in Taiwan, the Republic of China, when they came to the island in 1949. It was instead of the 6 million Taiwan islanders, those Kuomintang people came over and ruled the nation. And that was another very important character. As and for Sino-Japanese relations, former Prime Minister Ohira mentioned the following thing. In 1972, 1 week after the joint communique, that he attended some meeting and gave a lecture on the topic of the Sino-Japanese relations. And he talked about the relationship between the joint communique and the San Francisco system. On that occasion, he said that the relationship with the PRC cannot be severed. And by insisting on maintaining the San Francisco system, the two countries were able to come to terms over the relationship normalization. That is because of the existence of ROC. And there was a security treaty arrangement that survived until 1979. And there was also the bilateral national security agreement with the United States. And we are going to open the diplomatic relations by severing the relationship with Taiwan when it comes to Japan. The Taiwan was on the side of the U.S. From the viewpoint of national security arrangements, but still Japan was able to enter into economic relations with PRC. But the severing the diplomatic relations with Taiwan. I wonder if that kind of approach was adopted in the theater of Europe, because all the bilateral, there was the existence of a NATO. But here in the Asian theater, there were bilateral national security arrangements. So in East Asia, in the 1970s, there was a new approach. And I was talking about hot war. And hot war, how long did it last in East Asia? Vietnam War was ended in 1975, and the Chinese-Vietnamese War took place in 1979. And if you're going to include a Cambodian civil war, that it lasted until the end of 1980s. But after that, there was a rapid progress in the area of economic relationship, although there were some tensions and diplomatic difficult relations. And lastly, I just would like to briefly touch upon the territorial issue. As I mentioned at the outset, now the confrontation or conflicts over the territory and reparations and compensation, that those issues were deeply related to those San Francisco-related treaties. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, by signing that, Japan renounced territories. In the peace treaty with Taiwan, with the ROC, for example, that Japan decided to renounce Spratly Islands and other islands. Of course, there was an issue of how those renounced territories belong to where. But there was another big issue. That was the Cairo Declaration-related issues. In 1943, in the Cairo Declaration, the wording was different. Manchuria, Taiwan, Formosa, after the end of the war, they would be returned to the Republic of Korea. And that remained as an issue. And so those islands was regarded and to be returned into the Republic of Korea. But there was a confrontation over the interpretation between those two countries. Therefore, in the process of the negotiation, that the United States made a judgment on what islands should belong to where. And however, when it comes to the ROC and PRC, they used the Cairo Declaration. And other than this, now there was a question I raised about the Spratly Islands. Now, toward the San Francisco Treaty, there was no sufficient opportunity for discussion over the territorial issues, and also that the treaties that Japan entered into with the neighboring nations, those nations were authoritarian. But if I may use my colleagues' term, we are now entering a new age. In 2007, the Supreme Court made a decision, and that judgment overturned the previous judgments. And the PRC they argued back that the judgment was not accepted. It was not hardly touched upon by the press. So there's a sticking issue between Japan and PRC over this issue. So whatever the case, how we are going to interpret the San Francisco system, that's for one thing, but there is another aspect, how the other parties are going to interpret it. We have to know how their argument is. Otherwise, we will not be able to deal with those issues. So we have to take time to think about the other parties' position. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much. In part one, I served as moderator. But this time, I'll have a dialogue with Professor Kawashima, so I'm a little bit more relaxed to share my views with you. However, I am indebted by 5 minutes or so. I need to shorten my part of the time allotment, which is already short. But in response to what Professor Kawashima raised, I'd like to address a couple of points. But before that, San Francisco system is being focused upon right now. And why at the JIIA the historians are gathered and having these discussions? There is a Territory and History Center that was made under JIIA, and Professor Kashi and myself are also extending cooperation to them. When it comes to Asian issues, including Japan-China relationship as well as the Japan-ROK relationship, in order to improve bilateral relationship, territory and historical issues are sticking points. So using other countries' materials and to take into consideration the other countries' perspectives, but we should also be doing the same for the documents available from Japan to explore deeper into those aspects. So we need to gather those materials and documents. That's what we are doing at the center. In that sense, when it comes to history issues, we like to review all those things from the contemporary perspectives as well. What we need to get back to as a starting point would be the San Francisco Peace Conference as well as San Francisco Peace System, which is a series of Asia-Pacific order-making processes. So we'd like to reflect upon that. San Francisco Peace System. The last, research that came out as one lump research is 35 years ago. Professor Watanabe and Professor Seigen Miyazaki put out this book 35 years ago from the University of Tokyo. The joint research was done 40 years ago, and this book came out 35 years ago. What were the changes over the last 40 years? 40 years ago, well, the available documents, the U.S. availables as well as recently disclosed the U.K. documents at the time to conduct a study and research. And Professor SCHALLER also talked about that to expand further development. Over the last 30 to 40 years, there has been progress in historical verification that was witnessed in Europe as well as in Asia. I am engaged in European research. Professor Kawashima is conducting research in Asia. Europe, you may think that Europe may not be that important to consider Asian issues. From the contemporary perspective, that may be the case, but in retrospect, the UK and France at the time were major colonial empires in Asian countries. The 7 countries out of 10 countries of those Asian countries were former colonies of UK and France. Brunei, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the colonies of France. So 7 countries out of 10, those Asian countries, 7 were under those colonial rule. In 1940s and 1950s, in order to prepare for the Peace System Conference, and the UK and France played a very important role, particularly UK Commonwealth, then which includes the Australia and New Zealand as well. So adding those countries, we can come up with different perspectives as well as facts that have not been identified before. In Asia, which is a focal point in part 2, in many countries in Asia, the materials or documents are very limited, and however, many documents and materials have been disclosed by now, and so research has been progressing. So leveraging all those documents, materials available, we would like to focus upon what has been found, what are the differences from the past. So I'd like to discuss this matter from those perspectives. As Professor Kawashima mentioned earlier, and also the following the discussion of part 1, I came away with a very strong impression of the following, that is, San Francisco Peace Treaty. When you think about this one, there are some structural issues. Structural issues impacted upon the San Francisco peace system, which is Cold War and colonialization. The Cold War divided the world into East and West, and the colonialization prevented Asian countries from holding sovereignties. So without having sovereignty, the diplomatic relations cannot be achieved. So then, based upon the treaty, in terms of international law, you cannot define such relations by international law. So colonialization and the Cold War in 1940s, 1950s were the major forces covering Asia. So regular diplomatic relations or the nation-to-nation relations were very much limited in resolving the issues in between. As I mentioned earlier, the between PRC and Japan did not have any diplomatic relations. So it was very difficult to resolve issues bilaterally. Between ROK and Japan, we did not have any diplomatic relations. So it would be very difficult to resolve the issues by diplomatic channels. However, later in 1950s, 60s, and even further in 1970s, as Professor Hatano mentioned earlier, the resolving those issues came to arise. So many difficult issues that we are facing in Asia are related to the historical and territorial issues. Particularly the government in particular poorly handled all those issues, or they are not making any efforts. It's not like that. The structure in the post-war politics brought about those difficulties. So the essence, in order to understand the essence of those structures, we need to really understand the structure of international politics, particularly in Asia-Pacific region. Based upon that, then we'll be able to more clearly see the challenges we are facing. So that is the impression that I've arrived at after having listened to the discussions as well as the development research in recent years, particularly in part 2. the relationship between Japan and Asian countries will be focused upon. What kind of efforts have been made to resolve the issues, and in what way the issues have not been resolved yet. So that is a focus in part 2. So I'd like to ask Professor Kawashima this question, no matter what. And Professor Kawashima has been very much well versed in the diplomacy and politics in China, and you have a tremendous achievements. You talked about Cairo Declaration earlier, the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Declaration, and then San Francisco Peace Treaty. These three should be linked to understand the overall picture of the post-war order. So the Cairo Conference is something I checked when I looked at the UK document. However, the documents are very much limited. Based upon that, what was agreed upon? What was discussed? Hardly any documents are available about that. Against such a background, the important decisions were also made, and yet records are not kept. So Potsdam Declaration and the San Francisco Peace System put more in writing over those points to resolve those remaining issues. In a series of those unfolding events, San Francisco Peace System or San Francisco System, quite often such words are used. San Francisco System or Peace System for how is this system unacceptable to Beijing or China, or to what extent is it justifiable or rational? The conference was held in 1951, and there's a rationality at the time. And in 1978, the Japan-China a treaty was signed. And so I think the justifiability is different in those two periods, I believe. Now, in China, to what extent is this acceptable to China? At least the San Francisco Peace System and the other various agreements were also reached as well, with the modifications. So the post-war order that has continued. So to what extent China has dissatisfactions over that San Francisco Peace System that lasted in the post-war era? And because this situation seems to be a little bit teetering. And so from your perspectives as an expert on China, could you shed light on that?
Well, I think you mentioned that it was not a clear question, but it would require a thick book to answer your question. One point I would like to mention now, that the colonialism and the Cold War, I think those two structures are important from the research viewpoint. In the case of the Asian nations, I think in the late 1940s, many countries went independent. In the case of Africa, in the 1960s. So there was a Korean War that took place in 1950, and in the process, many Asian countries went independent. And Asia and Africa were supposed to be accepted among those emerging nations. And in that way, independence or sovereignty, those newborn countries paid attention to, and development approach for economic growth, and that was the highlight as well. And so from that viewpoint, there was an issue of reparations, and that was related to the action taken by the Philippines. Now, as for your specific bigger question, this is a difficult thing. In 1951, the ROC, Chiang Kai-shek, received the draft from the United States, and they made a series of proposals. Now, from that viewpoint, ROC was involved to a certain extent, and the PRC received information from the Soviet Union. Now, as for PRC, clearly mentioned that it was not be able to side with this system. And ROC was not able to participate in it, and so not a positive attitude. But in 1952, there was a peace treaty with ROK, and clearly it mentioned that it is dependent on the San Francisco Treaty. It was the unfortunate for ROC, it was not able to join the San Francisco system. But in April 1952, just before the ratification or the enforcement of the San Francisco Treaty, there was the peace treaty with ROC. So I should judge that PRC was more critical than ROC of the San Francisco Treaty. Now, at the time of the normalization of relations back in 1972, Kissinger they talked with the Chinese counterpart about the bottle cap of the cap of the bottle and there was the change from the old National Security Treaty to the new treaty in 1960. And I think at the time of the normalization of the relations with the United States, the Chinese approach was somewhat changed. For example, at the time of the Sino-Japanese Peace, Friendship and Treaty negotiation in 1978, to what extent the Chinese side was favorable or critical of the San Francisco at that time, San Francisco Treaty at the time? I think we need more scrutiny. As Mr. Ohira's statement or the lecture, San Francisco system was negatively appreciated by the Chinese government because it contained the security arrangements that were not good for the Chinese, China. So the Ohira mentioned that China could not be positive until the national security alliance. Now, as for the perception of the U.S. and Japan Security Treaty, the Chinese perception differed depending on the situation. There was a cap of the bottle theory. That was at the time of the Sino-Soviet confrontation. And then the China inched closer to Japan. But without that kind of a confrontation, in particular in the 1990s, that as a result of the modification of the national defense guideline between the two countries, that China turned to be more critical. Now, with regard to Cairo Declaration, there are very few evidential documents. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was in quarrel with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Chiang Kai-shek was not fluent in English. There was a diary, but there were those the aides who did the translation, and so how those things are going to be used in the 1950s, FRUS. It was compiled in those years, and on that occasion, the United States sent a letter, an inquiry, to the Taiwan, and then looking at the letter. And then the Chiang Kai-shek added some of the words into the text. So I think it requires a lot of the caution if you're going to use those documents. We can have a lot of discussion on the Cairo Declaration, but we have to sort out what would be the most appropriate documentary evidence.
Thank you very much. I still have a lot of points I'd like to ask Professor Kawashima. Shall we invite 4 panelists at this point? And the Cold War and the colonialization, the 2 points I referred to earlier. We'd like to invite the panelists to talk about the Taiwan, Philippine perspectives. In the process of colonialization, there are a lot of issues in those countries. And Professor Michael Shower will be also invited to the stage as well to make comments after the discussion. Sorry that I shortened the time to make comments earlier. So we like the 4 panelists to come up on the stage to share their views.
この先生がなんかモデレーターになってる。Now, we'd like to move on to individual presentations. So please refer to page 4 through 5 of your handout. You can see the bio data of the panelists. So we have 3 researchers. We have Professor Sao-Yang, Associate Professor of National Ming University. He is going to talk about post-war economic relationship between Taiwan and Japan. He is very actively studying this issue recently and using the both Taiwanese and Japanese materials for empirical studies. The next professor is Somei Kobayashi, Associate Professor of Nihon University. And not only Japan-Korea relationship, but including the United States, Japan, Korea, the U.S. Archives are being used by him. And centering on Korea, but expanding their views to Southeast Asia, he's studying, and his article was quoted for the so-called confidential treaty. The next speaker is the Professor Yusuke Takagi, Assistant Professor of GRIPS, and centering on the Philippines. He is specialized in the diplomacy and history of the country. He has studied in the Philippines for many years. He received the OHIRA Award, and he is at the forefront of the Southeast Asia history studies. Perhaps 15 minutes at the most. I have to ring the bell if you exceed 15 minutes. And we would like to have a comment afterward. Now, earlier, Professor SCHALLER should have taken up the issue of San Francisco system. How was it transformed in the emergence of PRC? And the question was raised from the Nikkei journalist, and he is going to respond to that question afterwards. Now, I want to invite Mr. Sao-Yang. Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the recommendation by Professor Kawashima, invitation of JIIA, I am able to attend this. I am very grateful. For the past 10 years, I have been studying Japan-Taiwan economic relationship from the end of the war in 1972, cessation of the diplomatic relations. Most of you are studying diplomatic and political history, but I am specialized in economic history, so I would like to report from that perspective. From the perspective of understanding the history of Taiwan in early post-war years, the historical study and economic history research communities are constantly debating the continuity and interruption that came with the end of colonial rule. And Japanese corporations and nationals in the areas under colonial rule lost their properties at the critical point of Japan's defeat in 1974. However, companies with assets in the former overseas territories and residents were compensated for the loss of their assets. Please look at this. I have 2 pictures. On the left, you can see the Mr. Fujiyama, and who is the chairman of the Council of Post-War Strategy for Overseas Business. On the right, Special Ambassador to the United Nations of the United States, John Foster Dulles. And on the February 3rd of 1951, Mr. Fujiyama requested the restitution of overseas assets. Fujiyama pointed out that the majority of the pre-war corporate assets in the colonies were of a non-military and peaceful nature. If the overseas assets were returned to the Japanese financiers, it would be possible for Japanese companies to play a part in rebuilding the economies. According to the conventions of international law, Germany, which was defeated in the First World War, had not been punished with the confiscation of assets. Therefore, a petition argued that Japan's overseas assets should not be confiscated. However, the Taiwan Business Association was not able to match the production of the output of efficiency of the Japanese corporations. The policy of detaining Japanese engineers after the war had highlighted the lack of management skills in the government of Republic of PRC. The Japanese financier did not claim compensation from the Japanese government, but insisted the assets in Taiwan, and it was quite cold treatment from the Taiwan. You are seeing the two pictures. This is the Japanese companies and Japanese corporations taking war risk insurance at that time. Because of the change of government, they were not able to claim compensation. And now the insurance companies were public companies, but they had a presence in Japan. Therefore, through the companies, the Japanese asset holders sent a petition to have compensations. However, because of the fiscal difficulty, the government continued to refuse. If the compensation is to be given, then all other properties confiscated should have been returned. However, because of the government's fiscal crunch, made it difficult. Now, the Taiwan Commercial Bank and the bank established in Taiwan had assets in Japan. They have become a Taiwan Commercial Bank and a Changhua Bank, and they wanted to restore the assets from Japan. However, what I would like to draw your attention to is that two banks, shareholders of these two banks are mainly Japanese people. Therefore, after repatriation, they wanted to establish their companies, and new businesses were attempted. In 1957, Nichibo Shin was established through the assets in Japan of Taiwan Bank, and 1959, the Kyowa Commercial Credit Association was established with the assets remained in Japan of Taiwan Commercial Bank and Changhua Bank and South China Bank. And this one, San Francisco Peace Treaty and the peace treaty between ROC and Japan can be expanded from the conventional observation of the history of diplomacy and sovereignty question to focus on population and cooperation. And how did the Japanese who had lived in the overseas territories before the war go about having their assets returned by the successor administration in the former colonial territory? In the case of Taiwan, some of the public banks wanted to recover assets held in pre-war Japan, and most of the shareholders of these banks are Japanese. Therefore, these assets were used to establish a new company. Now, I want to talk about China-Japan peace treaty and economic relationship. And the economic relations recovered in 1950, and the open account system was introduced. And this system, due to the lack of foreign currency, was introduced, and this system was applied to many trading partners. Such a system was not basically unaffected by the conclusion of the peace treaty and treaty between ROC and Japan. And development economies takes interest in the trilateral trade between Taiwan, Japan, and the United States since 1960s. And what was the actual economic relationship between the two states during that? In the 1950s, commercial capital accounted for much of the Japanese capital flowing to Japan. There were little industrial capital as the ROC government imposed restrictions on overseas remittance of proceeds, and the investment environment was still immature. And the Taiwanese government had an economic dependence on Japan policy. And in August 1952, the economic collaboration with Japan policy was announced. And Japanese economy and resources were given priority, and Japan should reduce the trading relationship with PRC. That was the wish. In addition to the relationship between the Taiwanese and Japanese governments, informal relationships were also important. Japan-China Cooperation Committee, for example, were officials in Taiwanese government, members of the Diet, and Keidanren members were included. And in 1965, yen loan was also facilitated by this commission. It served as a go-between. And from the perspective of economic history, I would like to understand how the Japan-Taiwan economy differed from Japan's economic relationship with other countries in Asia. And San Francisco Peace Treaty, Article 14, abandoned the right to claim reparations. Burma, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the South Vietnam do not abandon their claims against Japan. So consequently, these four countries separately negotiated with Japan and concluded a compensation agreement. And Japan offered economic cooperation to these countries, and also that promoted the export from Japan of heavy machinery. Taiwan had abandoned the right to claim post-war reparation from Japan, but immediately after the suspension of U.S. aid in June 1965, Taiwan received international yen loan to build infrastructure and update facilities. And in the past, development economy focused on the high economic growth of Japan. And however, in the case of Japan, the starting point was the economic compensation to concerned countries. So viewed from the development economics, usually focus on FDI, but this is very different from Japan's experience after the war because of economic cooperation rendered to countries. The third point is a Pax Americana. In this context, Taiwan and Japan both joined the anti-communist camp in the Cold War order, and they signed the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty and the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And at the same time, the MITI of Japan in 1950 also decided on Japan's trade strategy and provided economic cooperation to Asian countries to rebuild the economies. And because of the advantage of the commercial network, Japanese companies wanted to participate in U.S. agricultural product bidding. However, it was not easy to get successful bidding. Also, through assistance, the United States helped rebuilding of Asian economy. But in addition to that, we have to look into the activities of U.S. multinationals. Multinationals' investment in Asia, was it drifting apart from the U.S. government assistance? Japan, Taiwan, Korea didn't have much resources. However, American oil companies invested heavily in this region. situation. And U.S. aid projects provide little support for oil refineries, but major U.S. major companies covered the cost of updating the facilities for oil refineries with long-term loans. In the past, we separated the discussion of the U.S. oil companies' activities and government assistance. However, U.S. multinationals also provided much support for recovery of economy. And Japanese economy's activity in Southeast Asia also had been influenced by the U.S. policy of helping Asian countries to recover, not necessarily based on the wartime compensation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the interpreter was struggling because of the fast speed of the speaker. Now, when it comes to the point one, Chiang Kai-shek was pursuing a very generous policy by renouncing the reparations, but at the same time, the private-owned properties that were located in Taiwan, I think Japanese side was insisting that there should be the recovery of the property, but Chiang Kai-shek was very critical of this attitude. And then the Taiwanese banks that own properties in Japan, how would become of them? There should be some of the share of the properties, and that should come back into Taiwan, but Japanese shareholders also intervened. I think this is what the professor was talking about. This is still a big issue, and so how the properties, how they were returned to Taiwan, and there was a big issue whether the Kuomintang took all those property instead of returning to the people. Now, the second point is that Japan did not pay any reparations, but it did not start it with the ODA. But how? In 1965, there was the aid that was stopped from the United States. And then ODA was started to be provided to Taiwan by Japan. So back in 1965, the ODA from Japan started, and then development and style aid grant, the aid was started to be provided. So there was a switchover over here. And the third point is how was the relationship with the private sector, huge private companies, sector companies in the United States. And now over to you, Professor Kobayashi. This is Kobayashi. Thank you very much. From the viewpoint of ROK, how the San Francisco Peace Treaty is going to be interpreted, and what kind of things can I say in this connection? Now, in light of the current situation with ROK, the San Francisco Sister Treaty and the Japan ROK Basic Treaty that was adopted in 1965, those are the two underlying arrangements and that form the current situation between the two countries. At the same time, this framework itself, as you may know, contains some of the difficult issues, in particular with regard to the interpretation of the past. If that is the case, then the San Francisco Peace Treaty system and then Japan ROK Basic Treaty system, we have to look at the restrictions, limitations of those two arrangements in order to look into the future prospect. And I would like to share with you some of my suggestions in this connection. 15 minutes are given to me for my presentation, and I set the time limit at 12 minutes, and the warning would I would get a warning on my wrist. I think please take a look at the slide material instead of the handout. Now, within my 12-minute presentation, this is the topic I would like to talk about. What has been achieved and what has not been achieved, and what remains to be unsolved from the viewpoint of the Korea and Japan relationship in connection with the San Francisco Peace and Treaty. Now, I failed to use this pointer. So what has been achieved and what has not been achieved? And this is the topic I would like to talk about. Now, if I may jump to the conclusion, ROK, the Basic Treaty and San Francisco Treaty, the ROK has achieved some things, and on the other hand, there are also things that have been achieved by Japan. On the flip side, there are those things that have not been achieved, not only for Japan, but also for ROK. I think there are no the matching of those what are not being achieved. And that is part of the reason why we are seeing some difficulty in the current situation. Looking at the San Francisco Peace Treaty, the Allied powers, including the United States and the UK, but as for the ROK, and including ROC, I should say, that bilateral treaties were executed in order to solve the issues of peace. And Professor Hatana was talking about the issue of reparations or the claims. And this issue was taken up as an important sticking point in the negotiation. And how to overcome this sticking point was supposed to be a big issue that remained for 15 years during the process of negotiation. And in the following years, you can see PRC and the DPRK. I think this is supposed to be the bilateral arrangement in order to solve the problems. If this is the case, then the difficulty that the two countries face may re-emerge in a negotiation with DPRK, which I'm going to come back later on. Now coming back to this original topic and issue. Now, in 1951, negotiations started. The starting point was the San Francisco Peace and Treaty. And in the San Francisco Peace Treaty, ROK tried to sign the treatment as a victorial nation, but it failed. Only it was defined as a country concerned. And the issues that they had were not able to be solved in San Francisco framework, and so it was not invited to the San Francisco system, and the participation was rejected, and that served as a driver and then to start the bilateral the negotiation. And there were two important points and issues to be solved in the bilateral negotiation. New relationship is supposed to be established. Looking at the San Francisco system, that the Korean Peninsula or the Republic of Korea went independent out of the San Francisco Treaty system. Now, it was a former the colony and the southern nation, and how is the relationship going to be newly established? That was the very first point. And the second point was that the liquidation or settlement of the colonial rule. So those are the two important issues to be addressed in the negotiation. However, the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Basic Treaty between the two countries, the issues to be solved through this process. But in light of the current situation, there are some historical issues that are emerging these days. Now, including the claims agreement, there were supposed to be a solution of the problems, but those problems are once again there was the Supreme Court judgment back in 2011 in the Republic of Korea, and the Pandora's box was opened when it comes to the claims negotiation. In Namhyun government, there was an issue of conflict women as well as the Korean residents left over in the Sakhalin, and there was a demand then for the reparations and the compensation, but there was a consistent position taken by the Japanese government that those issues have already been solved. Now, how come we have seen this kind of situation? Now, as for the claims right, the right to make claims, there was no clear mentioning in the agreement. And as Professor HOSOYA explained, how to approach and then settle the colonial rule. This was, whether it was sufficient or not, in the San Francisco system, I think as a result, we are still seeing lingering question. And the Supreme Court decision was extremely important. Now, what has been achieved and what has not been achieved, there was a kind of a gap between the two countries, and which is evident today. For one thing, a legal interpretation. From the viewpoint of legal interpretation, the San Francisco Treaty or the Cairo Declaration, which has been referred to frequently by ROK, and then different agreements, several agreements, as well as the basic treaty between the two countries. How those arrangements, legal arrangements, need to be interpreted. In the interpretation of Korea, that the colonial rule was illegal. And there has been a series of discussions over the illegality or legitimacy of the colonial rule. So the whole question comes back into this issue, how the past is to be interpreted. And there is a gap between the two countries. And on the backside of the legal interpretation, this kind of issue still remains. And then there is, as a result, a structural barrier to overcome the issues. So that the ROK was established in 1948, and 70 years have already passed. ROK, and then since 1965, when the basic treaty was adopted, and within this diplomatic framework, how the past is going to be grasped. And once again, this issue has popped up. So in light of this kind of a situation, in order to open up the future, we have to take an appropriate approach toward the past. How to face the past is an important approach we have to adopt. And in light of this, how the confrontation between the two countries over the perception of the history should be overcome. And another issue is, which I was talking about briefly, now in the connection of DPRK and Japan relations, there is a possibility of coming back into this issue of the perception of history. In light of that, I think there was a confrontation over this issue between the two countries, although we believed that the issue was already settled. Once again, when it comes to the relationship with DPRK, the same thing may reoccur. And coming back into my handout, when you give a consideration to the relationship with Southeast Asia, there was, back in 1987, there was democratization in ROK. There were some bilateral arrangements executed with the authoritarian regimes, as the previous speaker was talking about. And then in 1987, South Korea was democratized. And the issues over the historical issue, the history, came to the fore after the democratization in 1987. That would mean after the democratization of countries in Southeast Asia, we may once again open up the Pandora's box. We have to be ready for such possibility and scenario. In case we are able to do that, how we are going to face the past is not an issue that is already done. Rather, for the stability of the Asia-Pacific region and the relationship, deepened relationship with the Southeast Asian nations, we would not be able to avoid this task. So the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Basic Treaty with the ROK, those two arrangements may have some problems from the viewpoint of the interpretation of the past, and the reality highlights the issue as such.
I want to ask you to supplement on 2 points because you were short of time. So in South Korea, San Francisco system, treaties system, how it is viewed in South Korea, and that is one point I would like you to expand. And also page 20 to 22 in your handout, you talk about 1965 treaty, the process leading up to that treaty. What was the problem in that process? In order to study those problems, are you using which materials from Japan or Korea?
Now, with regard to San Francisco Peace Treaty, there were good research documents in Korea. And page 23, now there are some reference materials in Korean. In top 2, Isans and Chons, Byung-jun, Dr. 1947. I think the territorial issues over Dr. or Takeshima, I think he is a leading researcher on this topic, and how it meant for Korea when it comes to San Francisco system. I think there were 3 things that he was talking about. First, the international status from the viewpoint of international law was taken up in the San Francisco system. If it is not a victorious nation, then what is it? And those Korean residents in Japan, the legal status is also related. Those nationals who are not the Allied powers, how the treatment is going to be given to that. And another issue is territorial dispute. The third point, the reparation claims. It was not solved in the San Francisco system, and so that bilateral negotiation should be the driver. And that condition was set by the San Francisco system. This is the first point. And the second point, now, as was shown in the handout on page 18, in the first part, for reference, the research on the ROK-Japan relationship and negotiation in 2005, the documents were disclosed, including diplomatic and documents. And the background for this action is that the compensation related to the citizens' movement. So because of that, the documents were disclosed. And in response to them, some Japanese groups took action to disclose the documents. And in 2008, some of the documents were disclosed. But the volume of the documents were larger, but some of the information was not disclosed. And so we have to rely on the Korean documents for reference. Therefore, for example, when it comes to the secret agreement, which was talked about, the secret agreement between Japan and the United States, whether they exist or not, there were some implicit references to the documents between Korea and the United States. That means that the VOA, $16 million, and that amount was communicated to Korea in that document. So we may need to rely on the Korean documents, whether it is correct or not. But it may be regarded as a correct document and recorded in history, and regarded as a legitimate history. If that is going to be a big issue, then I have to ask the Japanese government to proactively disclose the diplomatic documents. Otherwise, in light of the volume of the documents, there's going to be some hegemonic power is going to be lost on the part of Japan.
Thank you very much. Next, Professor Takagi, please.
I was looking for the switch. I'm Takagi with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Today I'm going to talk about the San Francisco system from the Philippine perspective. There's an outline which is rather short, so I listed the chronological table at the beginning. While I was making this, I had some findings. There are three philosophies that support the Philippine diplomacy. I was able to see those as I looked at this table. So, I'd like to go over the basic facts to follow the chronological table. In 1945, under this theme, what's important is twofold. One is Tokyo tribunals, and that has been discussed all the way today. And another thing that is important is that it joined the United Nations. At the time, it was under the colonial rule of the USA. So Commonwealth, the independent preparatory commission was holding the responsibility of the areas other than diplomacy. And but it joined the UN. And so the diplomats related to the San Francisco Peace Conference quite often refer to that. So the Philippines are the original member of the UN. So I'd like to point that out. In 1946, what happened in 1946 is important ones are put together over here. One is a request to MacArthur, request to Philippines to dispatch a prosecutor to Tokyo trials. And they sent the judge and also prosecutor as well. As Professor Hatano mentioned, de facto peace was progressing at the time. That's exactly right. This is one of those points. So in the Tokyo tribunals, the Philippines were more actively involved in those tribunals. In 1946, the second point in 1946 is that the Philippine Trade Act was enacted. That is, Bell Trade Act is another name. That is Trade Act of highly unequal of nature. In the Philippines, the U.S. company has conducted business in the Philippines. They can enjoy exactly the same rights as the Philippine companies. It's a free trade act, but from the U.S. to the Philippines, free trade available. However, from the exports from the Philippines to the U.S. Has some restrictions with in terms of volume. So that was quite unequal agreement. Why was it concluded? That is because of the damage from the war. When you look at some document, the president was very much aware of that. That means the U.S. made a Philippine Rehabilitation Act, but as part of the execution, this economic agreement needed to be accepted by the Philippines, so the Philippines needed to take that agreement. So based upon those preparations, the Philippines became independent on July 4th in 1946. At the time, Fuku, the agriculture, the farmers' uprising spread. And the related researches are many, but this is the communist armed communists uprising. That's the positioning stance on the part of the Philippine government. And that was the time in which the Philippines became independent, and then they faced the damage from the war. And internally, there was uprising by the armed communists. That was the situation at the time. So in that context, the In 1946, the military base agreement was concluded. Military assistance agreement was also concluded as well. In 1949, Carlos P. Romero, the very representative foreign minister at the time, was elected president of the General Assembly of the UN. And since this is just a chronological table, so there is not close-knit linkage in between. But in 1951, there was a San Francisco Peace Conference, and Philippines joined the conference and signed the treaty. And 1 week before that, the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and the U.S. Was also concluded as well. As was mentioned several times, hub and spoke system was used, and the Philippines joined the hub and spoke system. The San Francisco Peace Treaty signature I mentioned, they signed, but they did not ratify it. For ratification, the 2/3 of the upper house members' approval is to be needed. They brought back to the Philippines, then the upper house objected to that. And therefore, in 1956, when the Reparations Agreement was concluded, up until then, San Francisco Treaty was not ratified up until then. Then, from 1951, the negotiations for the reparations started. In 1956, the Reparations Agreement was concluded. The upper house of the Philippines Parliament ratified San Francisco Treaty. And all the rest of the details, I'll skip them. Simply put, the Reparations Agreement was concluded. After that, Japan wanted to strengthen the economic relations with the Philippines, and so they wanted to conclude the Philippine-Japan Treaty of Amity, Commerce and Navigation. But even the peace agreement was very difficult. But so the Philippines and observers were hesitant to conclude a treaty of amity, commerce, and navigation. So back in 1960, they finally signed that treaty. The administrative side signed it. However, the upper side did not ratify it again. And so that was just left alone. And this treaty was signed in 1973. That was President Marcos suspended the parliament. And that was after the suspension of the parliament by President Marcos. So under such a martial law, this treaty of amity, commerce and navigation was ratified. And there were no significant issues since that point on. In 1976, the reparation payments was completed, and so that's the end of the table. In 1977 was when Prime Minister Fukuda went Manila to announce the Fukuda Doctrine. From that point on, the Southeast Asia and Japan entered into a new phase. So when you think about the San Francisco system, 1976 is one, I think, end of the one phase, I would say. So table 2 shows some facts. As a basic facts, we need to be aware of these things. In Southeast Asia, countries except East Timor or Timor is not included in here. How did those countries were involved in the San Francisco Peace Conference and Treaty? This table and the first table are shown. And what I want to address out of these tables is that the Philippines' involvement in the San Francisco Peace Conference and Treaty is to get actively involved in the affairs related to Japan. For example, in the San Francisco Conference, Burma was invited, but they stuck to non-alliance principle, and so they did not join. Malaysia and Malaya and Singapore, they did not exist as countries, but those countries did not participate in the conference. For 3 countries, Indo-China, as Professor Miyashita mentioned, in the context of the Cold War, they were invited. So there was a greater side to that. So they did not necessarily play a very active diplomatic role. So these are the facts. Then, how is the research being conducted over these facts? The diplomacy of the Philippines at the time is amply researched. So I wonder if I would be the right person to join this particular symposium. I have that impression. But anyway, so the other experts have pointed out that basically 3 things. One is perceptions for Japan are severe by the Philippine authorities in the government as well as in society as well. As a result, San Francisco Treaty remained the article on reparations. And because the perception in Japan was severe, so they signed it, but they did not ratify it. So that was how it happened, what it happened. The second is, as a prior research mentioned about that, then why is it that the Philippines signed the treaty? And that was a consideration for their relationship with the U.S. So that has been pointed out. The third point is a slightly different dimension. What is commonly said is with regard to reparations, their diplomacy was not simply emulating the U.S. or diplomacy was led by politicians rather than bureaucrats. So the second point is that for reparations under the democratic system, they ratified it. In the Northeast Asia, this is different from the Northeast Asian situation. The third one is that domestic politics is more important rather than diplomacy. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in the earlier research by Professor SCHALLER, the emotional country is one labeling for the Philippines. Under these research points, the material related to the Philippines were from very early on, particularly the presidential documents. Carlos P. Romero's documents were disclosed from very early on for research, based upon which research has progressed. Professor Yoshikawa is really the star researcher in the reparations. In addition to those disclosed documents, the oral history was very, abundantly utilized by Professor Yoshikawa as well. So what are the remaining issues following these research? There are a couple of them. There are two extremes for the interpretation of the Philippines. That is a tough Philippine diplomacy. That is one understanding over the reparations, and they signed the treaty, but they did not ratify, so they are emotional. Then, what was the diplomatic authorities of Philippines thinking of? We need to think about that. Second point is the change over the medium to long term. The democratic system need to be considered for this one as well. When you look at the situation between the Philippines and Japan as it stands now, then the issues with China or South Korea, those politicized issues were very hard to think of. So that is one remaining thing for the medium to long term. Then, what am I going to talk about today? So I'd like to understand domestically as well as internationally. I was involved in the domestic research of the Philippines, so I don't understand international situations. So this is my more textbook-like understanding. Indeed, now, Form of Abroad book was referenced. Power identity approach was used by myself. That is power distribution. Japan is a small country, Philippines is a small country, but Japan is a big country. But not just that, what about identity issue? What about in the democratic system? But in the interest of time, so I skip figure 1 actually. So I'd like to move on to the figure 2 that I made. The perceptions appear to have changed vis-a-vis Japan. However, it's rather that Japan changed rather than Philippines changed. I think that is more appropriate understanding. In this figure, the bilateral relationship, structure surrounding bilateral relationship has been changed. During the war, there was the very much hegemonic, order was put in place under the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So, however, in the post-war era, hub and spoke system was put in place. So, in the hierarchical system, the Japan-Philippine relationship entered. And also, there's a security community, the international law, and the UN General Assembly framework. now position the Japan-Philippine relationship as well. That is another of the change. That's why I emphasize the UN. The Philippines, in the eyes of the Philippines, the diplomacy with Japan was some points. One is a memory from the past, and another is a reference point would be the relationship with the U.S., and the other is international order. So the UN and international order is the third reference point. And in that context, they were thinking about the relationship with Japan as well. So those are the points I want to address today. Put differently, the Philippine diplomacy is based upon the pursuance of a national interest based on nationalism and pursuit of justice based on internationalism, participation in the Tokyo trials. And the third is the pursuit of security guarantees based on realism, concluding mutual defense treaty between Philippines and the U.S. So those are the three components upon which the diplomacy was built. Historically, we can refer back to where they originated from, but I'll leave it on some other time. So the conclusion is that 3A philosophies comprise the Philippine diplomacy. So following that, when you think about the San Francisco system, including small countries, the multiple countries establish the San Francisco system. So there's a multilateral background to the San Francisco system. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. In the World War II, please give him the big round of applause. Sorry, I forgot to mention this. In the World War II, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific area, Philippines is the second largest sufferer of the war, it is said. And in the early post-war period, how Japan was positioned in its diplomacy, that was the issue. Earlier, I talked about democracy and authoritarian regime for reparation. Under the democratic regime, reparation issue was solved for the Philippines on one hand. In 1977, Fukuda Doctrine, that was I think, the turning point for the history for the Philippines, I think. So compared to relationship between Japan and Korea and Japan and China, I think 1977, Fukuda Doctrine played an important role in our relationship with the Philippines. So we have just received 3 presentations. It's already 5-1. And I want to ask Professor Mike SCHALLER to make a comment. And after that, I would like to consider how we are going to proceed further on. So please, Professor SCHALLER. And earlier you had a homework from the audience, San Francisco peace system, and the emergence of China today. How is it related to the San Francisco peace treaty system? Thank you.
Thank you. Is this working? Okay. I don't really have anything to add to these papers. They were all interesting, but I'll try to go back to.
Please, please, microphone, please.
What? Is it on? Okay. So I'm going to try to go back to some of the issues raised in the last panel you asked me about. One was that I talked a lot about the American perception of Southeast Asia as so crucial to Japan's stability. One of, I think, the ironies of the Vietnam War was that it sort of marked the fulfillment of the San Francisco system. It achieved the thing that the Americans had hoped for 15 years, the integration of Japanese and Southeast Asian economies, partly because of the huge flow of U.S. dollars into Southeast Asia. For the first time, there was a dollar surplus throughout Southeast Asia caused by wartime expenditures and GI travel and all sorts of other reasons. And Japan harvested those dollars in many ways, and it created the relationship the Americans had hoped for from 1948 on. So it was an irony, an unintended irony of the Vietnam War. At the same time, the Vietnam War sort of began to mark the unraveling of the San Francisco peace system. The American retreat from Vietnam, the rapprochement with China, really changed the dynamics that had underlay that system. So the Vietnam War was sort of central to fulfilling and beginning to unravel the San Francisco system. A second point I'd make was that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty has, ever since the 1950s and 60s, sort of oscillated like a radio wave. When U.S. relations with China were bad, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty took on added importance. When U.S.-Chinese relations improved in the 1970s, it became less crucial, as Nixon, the anecdote about Nixon pointed out. Japan reemerged somewhat on the front burner during the Reagan administration when it was seen as useful against the Soviets, but then again moved back towards the back burner. Now with U.S.-Chinese relations becoming more confrontational, it'll be interesting to see what new role that security treaty plays. Historians are much better predicting the past than the future, so how that will emerge, I'm not sure. But I'll just make two other historical points that relate to this general discussion. I was fascinated in the last few months at the rhetoric of the Trump administration towards China, because it was a replay of the rhetoric towards Japan in the 1970s and early 80s, that the Japanese, the book, American literature in the 70s and 80s talked about a Japanese plot to take over the world using trade as a subversion to take over unsuspecting nations, using loans and other kinds of accommodations. Is exactly the same rhetoric that was used during the Nixon years and part of the Reagan years as well. So you just change the names China and Japan, and it sort of can be the same critique. And then one last point that I've always been fascinated by is, and that hasn't been much discussed, although I wrote an op-ed piece in 2004, which no one paid attention to, was how the Bush administration, in the run-up and aftermath of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, used the Japanese experience as a model. People like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and even George Bush himself often talked about Japan as the model for what should be done with Iraq. And they used the example of a enemy nation, an authoritarian state, and the United States could transform, just as it did Japan, into a democratic, prosperous ally. It could use the same technique in Iraq. It was, of course, a gross misuse of history. It's hard to imagine two nations and cultures as different as Iraq and Japan. But it was fascinating to me that American political leaders would use that model, even though it historically was so inaccurate. So it was one way in which in the American memory, the Japanese experience was celebrated as a great achievement of spreading democracy, peace, and prosperity. It didn't work out, obviously, as the Bush administration hoped, but it was still seen as a way to use history to justify policy.
Thank you very much. Vietnam War, and also its relationship with the San Francisco Peace Treaty system is very large. And also its relationship with China, how can I say, that when the international situation in Southeast Asia changed, and also the value or the positioning of the security treaty changes and oscillates, and we have to have a historical perspective like that. And also, as is often said, the Trump's rhetoric vis-à-vis China today is very similar to the rhetoric vis-à-vis Japan in the past. And also, lastly, he mentioned the Bush administration often talked about Japan as a model to address Iraq. However, this is a historical mistake. These are the four major points. Professor, do you have a question to
それ特に
So, no particular question. Therefore, we want to start a discussion now. It's already 5:08, so we have slightly more than 20 minutes for discussion. I want to collect questions first. So, please raise your hands first. So maybe we have to end only with one round, but please, Professor Sakamoto first.
Thank you. Related to the overall discussion, thank you very much for wonderful presentations. I think hegemony and the secret agreement, your talk was accurate, I believe. Now, as for the peace treaty, I think Japanese documents are most promising. And Professor Takagi's 1960s, I think the talk reference to that is really important. Now, with regard to the overall discussion, we are talking about the San Francisco system without any clear definition, and Professor Sakamoto was also talking about that. I think for us, the Washington system, I think that was a scholarly terminology. But when it comes to the San Francisco system, this was a term that was coined by people in the 1960s. The national security is dependent on the U.S. Forces, and then Japan with the focus energy on economic recovery and growth. Now, with the existence of San Francisco system, and there are also other arrangements related to peace building. I think combined together, they are called the San Francisco system. Now, what is problematic in this regard is that, as has been mentioned by the audience, people from the audience, now, the Chinese interpretation and Japanese interpretation of the San Francisco differ. Now, the partners of the treaty are the ones that we have come into promise with those players. And whatever comments they make, but that's their argument, and that's not our argument. And so I think the definition should make clear if it is the San Francisco treaty system, whether it is the issue of ending the war and hostility. I think in that sense, the title itself may be somewhat misleading. And then, having listened to Professor Kawashima's argument, I felt in this way. Now, the post-war peace system, in this kind of a framework, that some of the partner countries switched them from the authoritarian to democracy. I think when it comes to ROK, we never entered into war with that country, but after democratization, their perception was changed. That is true when it comes to the issue of reparations. But once they open up this kind of discussion, the international community is not any more sustainable. Okay for them and to make comments, but they are not viable from the viewpoint of international relations. That the promises should come, whether it is justifiable or not. At the end of the day, it is not a matter whether peace can prevail all the time, but that if there is going to be a change in the interpretation from time to time, it is going to be problematic. As for the Constitution, that may be okay, but as for the treaty, it is an international promise. And so unilateral interpretation is not any good, or the third-party interpretation is not supposed to be good enough. So I hope that Professor Kawashima, I think that is not your intention.
With regard to the second point, Mr. Kobayashi, would you like to say something? In Korea, how the interpretation of the treaty has been changed in Korea. Although treaty defines something 100%, however, with interpretation, the treaty can be interpreted differently. So how the people justify that interpretation? That is a question given to you later on. Please answer.
I'm Hara. I'm teaching at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. I would like to ask a question to Professor Kobayashi. And how we should look at the past will be very important. So, Professor Kobayashi, what do you think? Could you share your own opinion? And I think the point you raised is exactly right, particularly the Japan-South Korea relationship. There are 2 points. One is Japan colonized ROK. That is considered to be an illegal act by ROK, so they are entitled to seek reparations. That's their assertion. The Korean court adopts such a perspective as well. On the other hand, the present values by international law, that was of course illegal behavior, but in 1910, at the time, considering the international situation at the time, that was not the case. I think that is the assertion by Japan. In 1919, Versailles negotiations at the time, their self-determination was mentioned by President Wilson, but that was only applied to Europe. That was not applied to Asia at all. That was a political compromise that was underway that started to progress in 1910. And if that was illegal, then the U.S. brought the Philippines to the colonization later is totally illegal. And so, what's your own opinion on that? That's my first question. Second point is, the reparation claim rights, the agreement in the claim rights for reparation, that's final and completely settled. That is how that was decided in the treaty. In the minutes that agreed upon, the Japan side mentioned the individual compensation, but the Korean side said individual compensation will be all done by the Korean government. So no compensation should be done by Japan or the Japan called the corporation money. All that money should be given to the Korean government. Only 5% was used out of that to compensate for the people. So the forced labor or comfort women, say compensation issues has been all resolved, and that should be borne by the Korean government. I think that's the stance of the Japanese government. What do you think about the second point? One more point. When I was in Canada, that was in 1990s, the Canadians, former prisoners of war, said that their status was against the international law, so they started to work on seeking compensation from the Japanese government. The Canadian government said that in line with the San Francisco Peace Treaty, they lost their rights to seek a reparation. So all the, claims for reparation should be made to the Canadian government, so they will take responsibility for that. And so that was a wonderful, I think, treatment of that issue, but the Korean government seems to be lacking that kind of approach. What is your own opinion?
Well, Professor Kobayashi does not represent the government of Korea.
Once again, I am advisor to Shimane Prefecture Takeshima Island Study Group. I have a question to Mr. Kobayashi. On your page 18, Japan-Korea treaty consists of 4 treaties and 2 protocols. It says, according to your paper, there is something missing which is important with regard to the that is exchange notes regarding the resolution of conflicts with regard to Takeshima Island and Korea. To Korea, the Japanese government says that there is no territorial issue of Takeshima, and you didn't mention this. Why is that? And on page 21, number 2, and the beginning of the negotiation between the 2 countries, and there are 2 here, and there is a period separated here, and there is a difference between Japan and the U.S. And the first stage started in the October 1950, and Japan says that the preliminary meeting started in the October of 1951, and in February 1952, the official meeting started, and you use the timeline of Korean side. Why is that? And another one is talks between the 2 countries. Negotiation archive was disclosed, and you said the amount of archives by Japan is larger than that of the Korea. However, I think that is a unilateral remarks. I have already written several articles already. The fishing negotiation in Takeshima Island, the Korean side's minutes of negotiation is quite rough, and also they do not mention something and eliminate something. And Korean side does not have minutes with regard to territorial dispute resolution. Therefore, it is only Japan that has records. With regard to claims right, in the first round of negotiation, the Korean side archive is missing one page. I think the Japanese government is blocking out some portion. However, Japanese government is more sincere because Korean side do not make a record right from the beginning. So I think Japanese government is more sincere. So I don't understand what you have said. Thank you. Any other questions? Over there, one or two more people.
Yeah,
My name is Mori of Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper. Now, there were the requisition workers issue with regard to the ROK, and so I think there was a lot of things I will be able to learn. On page 21, now over the issue of claims, there was some reference, and the Japanese the position is explained. And there was the historical background of Korean residents demanding for reparations, and how was it how it was settled diplomatically in 1965. That it was settled, I know that, but those issues of Japanese nationals that. Those who returned, returnees, was there any the trials and in Japan? How was the demand for the compensation by those returnees from the Korean Peninsula?
With NHK, I'm sorry that I'm also listening to Professor Kobayashi earlier. The Pandora's box is open for past, you said. In the eyes of Japan, I think the Pandora's box should not be open. Under the Moon Jae-in administration, they open all the Pandora's box totally, and having a devastating relationship with Japan. I don't think they are seeking that. So if both governments probably try to avoid escalating the situation further. But at point in time, the past, we need to squarely grapple with the past at some point in time, in your view? Or if that's the case, what will be the timing? What will be the trigger to make that happen? Could you share on this particular point?
Thank you very much. I think I have to give some time to consider to Mr. Kobayashi. With the prerogative chair, I have Professor Masuo of Kyushu University and also Mr. Higurashi, who is specialized in Japanese document archive. So, Masu. I am surprised that I was designated. Or listening to the discussion today, well, what I thought was that based on the discussions on the Japanese side, the San Francisco system, it is true that Japan was imposed by the victorious nations. The system was imposed upon Japan. However, this system was given to Japan by the West. However, this system facilitated reconciliation among Asian countries, and also in order for us to live in this area in harmonious way, I don't think there is no details offered by the system for that purpose. We talked about the colonial issue and territorial issue just now, but with Korea, San Francisco peace process, when it was taking place from the Korean government, the many issues were raised by the Korean side. And therefore, China and Taiwan didn't do the same as Korean did. by raising issues like this. However, not only colonial issue, that demarcation of territory limits is also inherently included in this issue. For instance, Spratly Island, as was mentioned by Professor Kawashima, it is clear that Japan is going to abandon. However, there is no attribution of those islands mentioned, because at that time the Philippines signed the treaty at that time, but we don't know in what way the Philippines thought of this issue back then. So I think we are entirely reliant on San Francisco system, and in Asia today we are now asserting what we think as the Japan's interest. I think there is a limit to what we can do in this framework of San Francisco system today. So if the panelists can answer this concern of mine. Sorry, I didn't mention your name right, but Mr. Ushimura K.
My name is Ushimura. I'm a friend of Kushi. The speaker is a friend. I think the war criminals and the war criminals at the trial. When it comes to the Tokyo trial, the 11 countries were the plaintiffs, and excluding India, and 10 countries organized and carried out the trial, and about less than 1,000 Japanese soldiers were executed. Now, Class B and Class C war criminals, the trials, the very last one in Japan, it was in April 1950, and overseas in 1951, June 11th. That was the last execution. Therefore, just before the enforcement of the treaty, the San Francisco Treaty, and such trials went on. And the UK rendered death penalties. I think the Singapore was controlled, and there was a long history of fighting with the Japan. And the second largest number was in the Netherlands. General Inamura landed on the Dutch territory and surrendered immediately. But the number of execution is the biggest, second biggest. I think that was a revenge against the control of the former colony. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, it was really strange. There were two different attitudes, as was explained in the previous speakers. When it comes to Class B and C, there was a lenient attitude. And there was an old song, in that song really gave a comfort to those war criminals, and they were saved them from the hanging. But those 11 judges, out of 11, 7 judges wrote the rendering statement. And the judgment, the statement, and by the Filipino judge, it was most severe, and the prosecutor from the Philippines was also very strict, and he was so emotional in the making an argument. And I think the very primitive attitude, and Judge Jaramillo agreed to the majority statement, and then he said lenient. That means too soft on the war criminals. And it is not going to serve as a model for the future. So I hope, if time allows, I would like to ask Mr. Takagi whether this was the consensus on the part of representing the Philippines, or just personal opinions. So it is difficult to just say the national tendency. Therefore, that as far as the trials on the war criminals, and there were differences depending on the country. And in the context of the peace treaty, and then the aim and objective was to build a friendship. But as for the war criminals, and that was not the case. And Australia was in charge of the criminal execution on June 11th, 1951, in the island of Manus. This is for your reference.
Thank you, Professor Yoshimura. In this session, we started shortly before 40, so we'd like to take a little bit more time. So finally, I'd like to ask Professor Kobayashi to spend 5 minutes or so to answer those questions. Professor Son-Yong and Professor Takagi have a question each.
To Professor Hon, between Taiwan, China, and Japan, concerning the territorial issue, the issues had been solved. However, there have been various perspectives taken by Taiwanese people. What are the contentious issues? What is the argument point? And please briefly explain what are remaining perspectives. And for Mr. Takagi, among Southeast Asian countries, as was mentioned earlier, the Philippines perhaps was ahead of other countries in peace treaty negotiation. The Philippines played a very important role in Tokyo Tribunal as well. Such behaviors of the Philippines, did it affect other Southeast Asian countries, or the Philippines' behavior was quite unique and was not followed by other countries? Now, first of all, 5 minutes to Professor Kobayashi.
Thank you. And very difficult questions, I should admit. And how should to respond to those questions? That's a big issue. Now, for the question with regard to the compensation for the properties, I think the Ministry of Welfare was in charge. Unfortunately, I have no enough information to share with you. The third question, Mr. Fuji's question. This time, when I prepared the handout, now with regard to claims, Osamu Ota's prior literature was used. Now, when it comes to the dividing or division of the timing or the period, I think I referred to Mr. Yoshizawa's literature. And I know about what you wrote about with regard to the fishing agreement. And while I was preparing for today's symposium, with regard to if we are going to highlight the issue from the angle which is different from the claims, then we may be able to see more different things. I think the same thing can be said to the fishing issue. That said, but I focused on the claims related issue. Now, the fishing agreement and the negotiation which was embraced within the context of the basic treaty negotiation, there are many different angles. So I think if we are going to highlight the different issues from different perspectives, then we will be able to see new things. I think this is one new direction we may need and to move into. I think there are going to be issues regarding territory and fishing rights aside from the claims. Now, with regard to the volume of diplomatic documents, Japanese side has a large number of sheets, but from the viewpoint of the absolute volume, there is a difference. What I wanted to say is that the blackened portion should be removed. That's my request. And the fifth point, Mr. Tsukamoto's question, I think that is a very difficult issue. Now, the South Korean government, 1.5 track or second track, separating, carving out the historical issue from the main track, and that's their argument. Now, as for the Japanese government, it is not a matter of a separation, but it is already settled whether separation is okay, and whether and then the political discussion should be organized or not. There will be three options available from this viewpoint. I don't know which one is most appropriate. I have no answer. And then if I have the right answer, I definitely would communicate that then to the ROK and the Japanese government. But at least what I would like to say is that for undergraduates and for graduate students, it is an important thing that we can engage in frank discussion. I think the approaches to historical facts need to be sophisticated by both sides. Professor Hara of Kyoto University's question clearly defined my position, and I think if I may respond to your question, if I have a clear answer to these questions, it would not be easy. It would be an easy thing, but everything is quite difficult. So the only thing that I would like to mention in this regard is that the ROK government's position and approach to the historical issue is interlinked with the discussions at the UN. So if Japan is going to view the historical facts, we also have to understand how the international community view Japan. Therefore, from that viewpoint, I should say that the Korean government is quite active in the UN, and the transitional justice concept and the ideas that has been discussed in the UN and fora, which the ROK government is paying attention to. So we have to take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Professor Hong, please. With regard to reparation claims, right? To the extent I know, I have several points. Before the war, there was a Taiwanese deposits issue. The war was over in 1945. Many Taiwanese came back to Taiwan. However, before the San Francisco Treaty, the deposits were frozen. Therefore, once again, they wanted to retrieve deposits. This had to be solved. And also, already solved issue, that is Taiwan's the wartime requisition of civilians, their wages, and also a guarantee issue for them. After the war, negotiation continued, and also not only government but also private sector associations worked on behalf of these laborers. However, some of these associations were formed with families of victims, or some of them were collecting fees from families. However, they were not providing good service. And also wartime war risk insurance. The only thing which has been solved is related to post office life insurance reparation. As of 2000, this was solved, and also compensation was paid to Taiwanese people. The amount was not very high. So war insurance issue. During the war period, the government used this as collateral. Therefore, to some insurance companies, the money was given. But in reality, the payment was not actually made. That's all. So the situation is different between Taiwan and Korea with regard to Japan's reparation. Taiwanese who used to live in Japan and the Koreans lived in Japan, so the treatment is very different. Therefore, comparative study is necessary.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for very appropriate additional information. I have two things. One is the awareness on Japan, and the other is whether the Philippine case is related to other countries' case. Justice Haraniya himself, it's a very his experience is important. Professor Nagai's research is very much detailed about that. So he was involved in the war, and he was serving as a justice as well. And so Bataan procession is where he participated as well. So he has a very severe view on Japan. And after the Bataan procession, he lived in Manila. Manila War is related to Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, Philippine battle, that was a very severe liberation battle. And so he saw a large number of soldiers who were so bloody. And so that can be said about both the justice and the prosecutor. Are they anti-Japan then? Well, that is a very difficult question. Justice Haraniya is a highly sophisticated person serving as a Supreme Justice and the colonized nation of the Philippines. Spain has a Catholic church that the U.S. made the schools. Quite often they say that. So he pushed for the modernization education in the Philippines. And from the elite point of view, in the Manila Liberation Battle, what they did was out of control. So that is the view of the Justice Haraniya. It's not that he hated Japan, but he considered the war to put the people into this level of injustice. So we have to think in that way. Otherwise, his view on Japan became lenient. Unless he had such a view, that would not be happening. So what was the situation when the World War II ended? That is important. The second point is that the Philippines handling the situation was the question related to what extent they can universalize that experience. That is very difficult because what is the region when it comes to that question? What is the region at that point in time? Southeast Asia. When did that word coin? The UK, when they designated theater, they used the word Southeast Asia. I forgot the year, but that was developed by the UK during the war, and the Philippines was not included in that. So Southeast Asia, as we think of nowadays, is the ASEAN was formed in 1967, and then Indo-China, 3 companies were incorporated. So in 1990s, the Southeast Asia were very much active. And so I think it will be very difficult to come up with the ASEAN concept. What about, to what extent the Southeast Asian people commit to the Bandung Conference? So Bandung was more important rather than Indo-China. So India as well. India was also included in the conference as well. So from the current map, the Philippines is located in the Southeast Asia, so they represent the voice of the Southeast Asia. I think we need to revise that view. We need to think about how or what the people are thinking at the time.
Thank you very much. Because of the poor chairmanship on my part, we are already 5 minutes behind. As was mentioned just now, the transition period justice was mentioned. Therefore, we should have a different dimension, transitional justice, and there are new and different perspectives given to new dimension. However, on the other hand, as I just mentioned, the concept of Southeast Asia in 1950s was not so clear, and there is a time-based context. So we have to clearly look into the history. How are we going to respond to arguments that we see today? But we have to have a very basic and fundamental historical framework to argue that. And also in understanding Asia, that is also necessary. And although time was very brief today, the part 2 of the program, we focused on East Asia and the formation of San Francisco system in this region. That was the theme of part 2. And Professor HOSOYA participated in part 1 as well. And also Professor SCHALLER gave a keynote speech and also part 1 and part 2 throughout the program. Thank you very much for your contribution. And also 3 excellent researchers on the panel. I want to express my appreciation. And also appreciation goes to, of course, the members of the audience. Thank you very much.
Professor Kawashima and all the panelists, and thank you very much. And please return to your seats. Lastly, I would like to invite Mr. Nakayama, Director General of JIIA, to make closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in today's symposium for many hours. 151 people participated in this symposium. Thank you for your active participation. Today's symposium was able to make a good discussion on comprehensive and multilateral discussions on the San Francisco system. Professor SCHALLER and the moderators of each panel, Professor HOSOYA and Professor KAWASHIMA, and all the panelists, I would like to say thank you very much, and to all of you. As has been touched upon by Professor SCHALLER and Professor Hatano and Professor Sakamoto, San Francisco Peace Treaty and U.S.-Japan and Security Treaty provided a foundation for achieving Asia-Pacific international order, despite some of the flaws. As Professor Miyashita mentioned, a French punitive attitude toward Japan, or the Versailles type peace treaty as represented by Italy, despite those precedents, based on the fact of U.S. and Soviet confrontation, the Allied powers, including the United States, intentionally selected this course. And when it comes to the Japanese side, and through San Francisco Peace and Treaty, how Japan was able to position itself in the international community, I think this was touched upon by Professor Kusunoki. And Professor Han mentioned that the post-war treatment based between Taiwan and Japan was touched upon. And Professor Takagi explained about how the development was between the Philippines and Japan. And Professor Hatano and Professor Kawashima explained there were some of the historical issues that were contained under the San Francisco system are now emerging as a result of the shakeup of the international community today. And as Professor Kawashima pointed out, the San Francisco Treaty also served as a source of the confrontations and the conflicts over the territories. And Professor HOSOYA mentioned that the issues related to territory and history come from the structural issue of the problem of the San Francisco system. I don't know if my summarization of the discussion was sufficient or not, but I'm truly grateful to all of you for insightful and fruitful discussion. This symposium is a part of the so-called History and Territory programs, research programs. This History and Territory research program is aimed to communicate the latest research outcomes based on the objective scholarly review, so that many people will be able to have better understanding of the balanced and the balanced understanding of the history. Today, the symposium focused on the historical perspective of San Francisco system, but going forward, we hope that we are going to open up the forum for the discussion from the viewpoint of territories. We are also planning to organize the symposium overseas as well, so that the promotion of the understanding can be achieved. Please refer to our website and CNSNS for more information. With regard to the outline of the discussion that we engaged today, will be incorporated into a publication. Once again, I would like to say thank you very much, and for all the panelists and the participants. Thank you very much. With this, the symposium comes to an end. The earphones are for simultaneous interpretation. Please leave them on your table or return them to the Secretariat or at the reception. Thank you very much.